Good evening, everyone. Happy New Year's. We're so excited to see you guys in this brand new year of 2023. Here's to hoping 2023 is kinder to us than 2022 was. We are so excited to have you guys here tonight because we have a special guest. Today's book, Busboys and Books Present, is The Trauma of Caste. And our amazing author and Dalit American artist, community organizer, technologist, theorist, activist is Thenmozhi Soundararajan. And currently, she's the executive director of Equality Labs, which she co-founded. It is the largest Dalit civil rights organization working to empower caste-oppressed people in the U.S. and globally. Through her work there, Thenmozhi has mobilized South Asian Americans toward dismantling an eons-long system of oppression that we'll learn about more today, with the goal of ending caste apartheid, gender-based violence, white supremacy, and religious intolerance. She's previously co-founded the Third World Majority, an international media training org and collective that supports people from disenfranchised groups. I got a little quick there, in telling their own stories in their own way. And without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and bring her on. Good evening.
Hey, good evening. Hi, everybody. So glad to be here.
How are you today? Where are you tuning in from?
Well, I am tuning in from the Bay Area. So we are bunkering down for the storm. But, the thing is that while you're waiting for rain like that to break, there's nothing like being cozy and building with, beloved community all around the world. And so I'm so glad to be here with Busboys and Poets because you guys are one of my favorite bookstores in DC. And I really feel like it's a big coming home to be able to be here with you all tonight.
We're so honored. And speaking of cozy, I love the holiday decor still in the background. Very just like, it really brings the cozy to tonight, which we're going to kind of need because this is kind of some serious and deep stuff we're going to be talking about. If you don't mind, do you mind giving a quick content warning for our audience just in case?
Sure. My book, The Trauma of Caste, talks about, really in depth, some of the violence that surrounds the system of exclusion that is caste. And so we will be talking about things that are hard. We'll also be talking about where that pain might live in the body. But I also think that there is going to be opening and transformation and healing as we witness with each other about this incredible, system and the movement that is working to dismantle it. So, I do want people to take good care of themselves during this conversation. And if anything becomes too overwhelming or you need to take a pause, like you are responsible for self-regulating around this conversation. But I do deeply appreciate you engaging and building beloved community with me and other caste-oppressed people. So I'm really looking forward to getting into it today.
Awesome. We're really excited for you to get into it with us. And so to kind of get us started, what made you write this book at this time? Like, why now?
Well, for me, I think a big part of it, just like, most of the folks that are out here, the pandemic really created this opportunity of reflecting, especially as we saw the end of so many things, right? There was not only the violence of the pandemic, but for many South Asians, we opened the pandemic coming out of a very violent turn in our homelands, where the Indian government basically, passed a law that started basically a genocidal project in the country, and it's one of the largest in world history. So we basically went from a genocide to the pandemic to, an uprising, right? If everyone remembers what happened after George Floyd, and then, of course, a coup. Right? All of that is enough to make someone say, wait a minute, we have to think about things differently. But also my mom fell ill and, she became terminal. And I think as I watched her fight for her life, there was something in me, especially as someone who's been an activist for many years, I feel like I was seeing the cycle of us fighting for our rights and watching our rights being removed, both as people of color and caste-oppressed people. And so I just felt like we needed to approach these problems differently. And so, especially as someone who faces an incredible amount of violence for speaking out about caste, I felt that I wanted to understand this violence in a deeper way, not just like get an attack and then fight back. I wanted to go deeper into the root causes. And that really only comes from meditation and deep reflection. And so the pandemic gave me that time. And so I really tried to use that moment to see if I could offer back to our community a new way to approach these wounds and ultimately center healing.
There's so much, and I really, really loved your answers throughout all of that, because it's a project of love for your community, for yourself, for like, I don't mean to overstep, but like, it sounds like almost like for your ancestors, your parents, your grandparents, like, everyone that's been affected by the caste oppression system, like in India, here at home in the United States, for us, globally, as you've said. Thank you for sharing something like that with us. And I'm so excited for us to get into more of what you have to share with us, because folks, her writing is just as good as how she speaks and explains things. It's really, really awesome. Oh gosh, sorry. I'm like,
well,
I just want to
but
hear more.
You're not overstepping, Lori. This was really an act of like me communing with my ancestors, because, you don't have to be a caste oppressed person to have felt the pain of the last couple of years, especially as we see our rights taken away in so many different forums. Like, there is just a level of heartbreak that comes from that. And I think that it's very easy for us to then become smaller versions of ourselves, ones that become more defensive and more angry, and let them steal our light. And I think that I did not want that to happen for our people. And, of course, we are all in a mutual set of struggles together. But I think for the South Asian community, we do not show up in right relationship with many communities because we haven't done our work around our core wound, which is that of caste. And that's why I wanted to offer this, so that we could really be able to help be better allies with the larger struggle for racial justice in the United States and with movements around the world. Because until we kind of take care of our own ish, we are not going to be in right relationship with others.
Yes. And I just want to point out that you made such a great, bright little light from the turmoil of the pandemic. So before we kind of jump into it, maybe for our audience members who aren't quite sure what some of the words we've been using are thus far, could you break down what caste is?
Sure. And, caste is a system of exclusion that is, that may have come onto people's radar with Isabel Wilkerson's book, Caste, the Origins of Its Discontent. So if you're a reader who's coming to this from that, you may already know a little bit about the system of exclusion. But, the thing to know is that it's a system, similar to race, but it's not the same thing as race. And in fact, it has.
I'm so sorry. As you can tell, I have a beagle.
Oh, thank you for joining us, Lori's dog. So the system of caste actually has its origins in 2000 BC. And, like race, it's based on a social fiction. It sets up a group of people at the top of a hierarchy that basically created these arbitrary rules that said that they were more spiritually pure than others and that their jobs are ranked at the top. So the people that set those rules, because this was a system rooted in religion, were the priests or the Brahmin caste. And then, following them down the caste pyramid are other professions with degrading levels of spiritual purity and more exclusion. So it comes first Brahmins, then the Kshatriyas or the rulers, then you have Vaishyas who are the merchants, you have peasants who are the Shudras, and then outside of that whole system are people who are deemed spiritual criminals, people who did something bad in another life and therefore deserve to be excluded and punished in this one. And so they're given the worst jobs. They are shunned, and they're even called untouchables, because to touch them is to become spiritually impure. And that was my caste, my people's caste. And, untouchability, and even the term untouchable, is so vile. It's a slur for us, because what someone is saying, that they can define your position towards God. But who gets to determine that, right? So we actually don't even use the term untouchable, and we use terms like Dalit, which is like a political term. It means, someone who has been broken but is resilient. People might also identify as their religious term. They just want to get away as far as possible from this term untouchability. But in the United States, people usually use the term caste-oppressed, Dalit, or even they might even hear the term Ambedkarite, because these are people who are naming themselves after a very famous caste-oppressed leader named Dr. Ambedkar. And you can think of it like folks who name themselves as like after Marcus Garvey, like, the folks that were from that movement. So it's really, for us, we need to escape this system because of how violent it is. And it's why we fight for caste abolition. And so you'll hear all throughout the book, not only introductions to the system of caste, but also what it has done to both the caste privilege and the caste oppressed to have grown up around this system that is so taboo to talk about, but is completely omnipresent in our institutions, in our families, and in our relationships. And that there is no way for us to move forward as a people until we start to address this systemic problem.
Wow, it sounds just so fully ingrained in your society, just religious aspects, economic aspects, social aspects, just entirely. Wow. Okay. Well, that was a really great answer.
Thank you, Lori. And the book actually has, I'm not going too much into the data, because the book really covers the way caste is experienced across all of South Asia. But, one data point, I think, which really haunted me, was the fact that the average age of mortality for Dalit women is 39 years old. 39 years old, right? Yeah. And that was pretty shocking to me. And then I also think that, a lot of times I think for people that are based in the US, we're like, well, that is a really fucked up system, but that's in South Asia. It's not happening here. But, in the work that we do in Equality Labs, we have found that wherever South Asians go, they bring caste here. And we conducted one of the first surveys about caste in the US, and it was shocking the amount of discrimination and bigotry that we saw here. And in our own survey, 1 in 4 caste-oppressed people experienced physical and verbal assault, 1 in 3 educational discrimination, and 2 out of 3 workplace discrimination. So we have some of the highest rates of discrimination and bias than of any Asian American community in the country. And that's why this is important. This is not something far away. It's happening here, and it's making our workplaces unsafe, and we have to do something about it.
I mean, like you said, it's something that's eons old, and something that like we have to work really hard to work against and break. Earlier you described the word untouchable as vile, and it's so vile. It's violence. It's violent. It's like what it embodies and what it just symbolizes is so much more than just like, oh, don't touch them. Like even that phrase alone is just, there's so much behind it. Well, there's a lot of trauma behind living within a system that is caste-based, but being a caste-oppressed person. One thing that is unique about your book is that you approach caste through this kind of lens of trauma. Can you explain that more?
So I think one of the things that is really important to understand is that, in the South Asian context, we have a lot of books that explore the political and economic impacts of caste. Very few, if any, to really understand what the trauma is that comes out of this massive, centuries-old systems of exclusion. And for me, that was really important to kind of really ground my book in, because I'm someone who's born in the diaspora. And I was really shocked that caste was here because, my parents left to come over here. And, dominant caste people are not in power here. So why are, South Asians replicating it? And when you read like the work of Indigenous sociologists and therapists and Black somatic abolitionists like Resmaa Menakem and Eduardo Duran, they have done a lot of really beautiful work that really talks about the fact that, it's not about books, it's not about workshops, because systems of, exclusion aren't just about the intellect. They're about the way that our nervous systems have been wired to accept complicity and violence and dehumanization as the norm for our base of operation. And so when I really encountered their work, it was like a light bulb kind of opened up, because I was trying to understand why anyone who was rational would actually accept the massive dehumanization and bigotry that comes along with caste, And so I really talked about and used the work that came from those really beautiful trailblazing thinkers to talk about this idea of the caste soul wound, and for anyone that has never heard the term soul wound before, it really, from the thinking of Eduardo Duran, it's this idea of that people carry with them wounds that go beyond their own individual life, that have to do with intergenerational harm and intergenerational violence that results from massive, tragedies like, Indigenous genocide and the enslavement of African peoples that were the origin of the settler colonial state, right? So in that same spirit, you cannot have the massive dehumanization that has led to hundreds of millions of people being enslaved and violated and extorted and exploited and raped and murdered and lynched the way that you have under caste without consequences to our nervous system. And so I think we've rarely ever been able to slow down enough from our cycles of polarization to just witness how are our bodies experiencing caste harm, and how have we been trained from our networks of caste privilege or the caste oppressed to behave around this issue. And this book was really an attempt to really help slow down the conversation and invite people to start paying attention to their bodies as a text around this violence. And in that way, it's very similar to, for me, the other kind of big influence, of course, were women of color feminists like Bell Hooks and Gloria Anzaldúa that really gave us a language for embodiment as a pathway for freedom. And so in writing this, it really was like a call to the ancestors to say, we are not going to get out of this mess unless we start to pay attention to what's happening in our hearts and our bodies and our minds and spirits under this violence, So I think maybe, what might be helpful is I can share a passage about this. I can kind of give people a little texture about this, if that works for you, Lori.
That would be amazing. And while you do that, I'm going to jump off stage so we can give you the full screen.
Oh, thank you, Lori. All right, so this is from a section that is called Caste is Suffering. This is some profound existential shit. Imagine your worth and your fate are irrevocably determined at the moment of your birth. You are condemned to a life of servitude, humiliation, and exploitation. You are less than human. You have no choice but to live in a caste apartheid of segregated ghettos and be denied access to schools, roads, basic amenities like fresh water, and you're forbidden to speak, to listen, and even read the language of Sanskrit in which the laws that determine your fate are written. You're not even allowed the consolation of spiritual practice, some kind of relationship with the higher power, because you are considered spiritually defiling before God. This life sentence, and let's be clear, this is the sentence to be a slave, a spiritual criminal, is decreed in the scriptures that form the basis of your society. If scripture itself condemns you to being an outcast for life, who then would challenge the law of God? If caste sounds similar to race-based oppression, it's because it's analogous to race. And caste impacts over 1.9 billion people in South Asia alone, and over 5.7 million people in the United States. The numbers of bodies sacrificed is so huge that there isn't a container big enough to hold the grief. It is a cascade of violence. How do you effectively acknowledge all of that suffering? What happens to us with each additional harm? Those who survive these atrocities carry that violence with them. Families are left holding the memory of their loved ones and having to fight, not just for 1 or 2 years, but often 15, 20 years, in accountable judicial systems that give them no respite. And even then, fighting for justice is not the same as healing, because the pursuit of justice often leads to more injustice, which leads on more harm inflicted on survivors and families in the form of gaslighting, counter cases, and smearing of your lost loved ones. It brings to mind Dr. Gabor Mate's poignant words on trauma, which says, trauma fundamentally means a disconnection from self. Why do we disconnect? Because it's too painful to be ourselves. Imagine the disconnection that caste-oppressed people must endure. In unending atrocity, violence, and indignation, there is never a space to process or to heal. Instead, there is the inhuman expectation that we will keep working, carrying the economy while our bodies, our psyches, our relationships bear the cost of violence, of caste apartheid, generation after generation. Instead of respite, there is only further exploitation, punishment, of denial. That denial is actually the core, secondary part of the wound of being Dalit. It is terrible enough that our bodies and spirits are broken, maimed, and desecrated. It is worse that no one acknowledges it, and that you can have mass murder and the world goes on with its business every day. It is worse when we inflict that wound on ourselves, denying ourselves the space to grieve and to release the suffering in our bodies. Instead, we sink deeper into the closet, burying our identity and sorrow and our histories in hopes that we will not be outed and experience further harm. These are the challenges that are the least explored among caste-oppressed people, and yet our bodies, minds, and spirits need healing on every level for us to be embodied in the face of such violence. For as Peter Levine has shared, trauma is caused when we are unable to release blocked energies, to move through the physical and the psychosocial reactions to hurtful experience. Trauma is not what happens to us, but what we hold inside of ourselves in the absence of an empathetic witness. All right, Lori, let's get back to these questions.
Oh my gosh. Thank you for reading that. The way that you're talking about trauma really resonates with me personally. So earlier when you mentioned Resmaa Menakem, I was like, yes. I read him in undergrad as part of kind of my gender and sexuality center experience. I was part of student life in that way. And we read about it and I was like, wow, this is the first time that someone's put into words kind of like his idea of like the soul nerve and the soul, like
Yes.
in relation to like the deep and like heavy, like shame and just trauma that is so deeply aligned almost in ourselves at this point with the way that things are in our society. How do you even start the healing process to that? What have you found to be helpful?
Well, I think it all starts with the body, because I had that same reaction to Resmaa Menakem's book in myself, because, I have been a leading expert around caste and been an organizer for many years. And I could intellectually break down this issue. I can be an advocate in so many different places. All of that is true. But what was not something that I could really put a handle to was how much the burden of this violence was really being carried inside of me. And so I think by the time we got to the pandemic, I had high blood pressure, I had panic attacks, and a large amount of that was because I had people who were constantly coming after me to try to intimidate me from stopping talking about and breaking the silence about caste. And these are people who issue murder and rape threats. These are people who continually try to deny, that caste exists, and try to smear or taint the conversation by accusing me of being a terrorist, or what other garbage that's going to come out of their mouths. But there is a cost to being out as being a Dalit. And it's one of the reasons why my parents hid their whole lives. My parents lived in the closet for decades because they were afraid of the consequences. And even today, in our research at Equality Labs, over half of the Dalits that we surveyed said that they prefer to live in the closet because they are so terrified about the consequences of coming out. So
And sorry for interrupting. By living in the closet, for those of us who aren't in the know, what does that mean as a caste-oppressed person?
Well, thank you for asking that question. So I think similar to queer people, many Dalits who, once they immigrate here, there's a chance for them to try to hide their caste background by pretending that they're not Dalit. And so they don't tell people their caste identity, and they essentially live in the closet. So when people ask them things that would mark them about caste, they either lie or punt the question to try to avoid being located in their caste identity. And, as someone who grew up with parents who hid that, I know that experience pretty intimately. And many of my friends live in the closet who are Dalit. And it's because they don't want to deal with the absurd and just outrageous levels of bigotry that caste privileged people, inflict on, people like myself. And I think that for me, transformation in terms of understanding the trauma of caste really began with slowing down and centering my own bodily experiences. So, and I don't know if this is something that people in the audience can kind of relate to, is that, in a given day as a person of color, you might have so many different indignities. You might have that microaggression at work. You might have the racism in your neighborhood. You might have someone physically try to attack you. Maybe you look at the news and you hear another depressing thing about how people are, trying to deny the history of slavery and are banning critical race theory or attacking queer folks, in some new, campaign of terror. The cumulative effect of that is that we're expected to still show up at work, to still be our normal selves. But in fact, it's incredibly difficult to do that because what we're shoving down is our emotional experiences of racial stress. It may be up to here, but we're expected to shove it down and then go to work 9 to 5 every day as if nothing has happened. But it takes enormous physical discipline to do that. And what happens is all of that anxiety and things that might be externally expressed now go inside of our bodies and start to trigger somatic responses. And this is one of the reasons why people of color and caste-oppressed people have very high rates of stress-induced diseases like high blood pressure, diabetes, panic attacks and depression. These aren't just individually originated diseases. These are diseases that are consequences from living in violent societies. And so as I, not only was kind of mapping my own kind of blood pressure and, anxiety from the panic attacks, I was also watching my mom, who was terminal, fight for her life after a lifetime of living with these conditions as well. And so in order to break that cycle of violence, break those generational, curses, it was really about how do we approach this violence differently? And so again, a big part of it was really understanding that, we can talk about the political and economic policies that need to change caste, but we first and foremost need to look at what's happening in our bodies. We need to recognize the soul wound that comes from caste and racial violence. And we need to see how do we show up either as the oppressed and as the privileged. Because the other key part of recognizing the trauma of caste is that we stop trying to only focus on caste through its consequences. We know that Dalit people are raped and murdered and excluded and face discrimination. But what is going on in the bodies and minds and spirits of the privileged? What allows them to dehumanize another? How have they trained their nervous systems for complicity, for silence, and for violence, right? Very rarely do the privileged get to have the spotlight on their bodies and their nervous systems. And usually when you start to bring up the question of caste, it is always dictated by the pace of the nervous systems of the privileged. You know, if the bigoted are feeling uncomfortable about this issue, all of a sudden the conversation stops. But you know what? That's not the way the law works. The law does not work at implementation at the point of discomfort. The law for civil rights is about ensuring access for all.
Ooh, looks like we're frozen, but you're getting in there, and I loved it. Oh man, I knew that some technical difficulties might happen since. Hello, you're back. You stopped really strong. I will tell you that.
You see me? I'm back.
Yes, you stopped really strong, so you're doing great.
Okay, awesome. I must be that storm kind of coming through.
That's what I literally was like. It looks like those technical difficulties are coming through. I'm so sorry that it like broke your stride, because you were spitting some like heat there. What you're talking about is so real, and it's just
Well, and it's not, don't worry, the internet cannot stop the flow of justice. We are here. So I think, but I think that thing for that invitation, because all of us are people who have, parts of our identity where we know what it is to be, oppressed. And we also have parts of our identity where we know what it is to be privileged. And there is a lot of unlearning that we have to do in our nervous systems, training around our points of privilege that actually can help us stop being the obstacle for freedom. And that's really where, the idea of trauma becomes even more, I think, urgent, because I think that so many of our bigotry and cycles of polarization in our societies are really coming out of the fact that those who are privileged are not slowing down enough to have awareness of their nervous systems. And so we're watching all of society be held hostage to basically their psychosis around their vision of like how uncomfortable they are about the prospect of equity. But we don't stop equity. We actually have to like get rid of their discomfort. And the people that are most able to get rid of the privileged discomfort at the prospect of equity are other privileged people. So we need to really make this not be on the burden of the excluded. And this is where I think, there's a lot of tools in this book to really try to get to that process. So there's like workshops, there's meditations. I also spend a lot of time, not just talking about data, but really slowing down people to give examples of my own embodied reactions to certain ideas and experiences and personal testimony that I think then can allow people to say, oh yeah, I feel that in my gut too. Or, oh yeah, I see my jaw clenching. Or I remember that really made my breath catch. Those are the things that when we start to pay attention to our body as an actor and our decisions, we can start to really see where there can be more opening as opposed to like polarized positions.
Thank you for sharing. And I just really want to emphasize what you mentioned about like allyship and solidarity, in the sense of like those who are privileged, like do the work with those who are also like in your like pool of privilege. Like, it's for everyone watching, please just communicate that to those around you. Because it's exhausting. And it's so funny because like I feel like we as like American public haven't quite reached that place of like understanding that this is all a trauma across the board and we need to address it. I feel like we're slowly getting there. And a big part of that is like actively questioning like white women and their discomfort, like active discomfort in the everyday with just the presence of Black people, Black men, Black women. So yeah, I'm hoping that like we can get to where the place that you're talking about, like sooner than later. Because like you mentioned, we've seen uprisings, like globally, but here at home, like the summer of the uprisings after George Floyd, we're still seeing a ton of activism and mutual aid efforts and just all kinds of advocacy happening across the country, which is really, really awesome. But to kind of bring us back to trauma and healing from it, because I want us to like have a little bit of some nice stuff in here. How do you think healing is crucial to ending these systems of oppression? Like, you've talked a little bit about it thus far, but how? Yeah, I'm going to leave it at that. How do you think it's crucial to ending these systems of oppression? What have you, like, you've discussed a little bit of how you learned in committing to caste abolition, how there's it can be a dangerous thing, but what have you found that has also been like a healing part?
Well, I think that, it really starts with our bodies. And, I have a really dear friend who's based in DC, Dara Baldwin, who is this incredible disabled civil rights activist. And she was someone who really, made me think differently about healing, because, she had this like really, amazing story about her mother, who was a Black Panther and like a, award-winning educator, who was always a community leader. And when she finally retired, it was like she had lived a life, a life of service, a life of activism. And shortly after she retired, like almost 1 year to her retirement, she passed away from a heart attack, essentially because you can't wait till the end of your life to heal. You have to show up in the ways that you build movements with a way to be whole as a person. And, again, the pandemic really brought that home to me. And I'm sure for many of the people that are listening, if you came from a Black and Brown community, you knew that COVID ripped apart our communities much differently than it did white communities. I mean, I have friends who lost 20 family members in their from COVID. And you, again, if you go to like a kidney clinic, or you go to, a place where people are getting dialysis, all of the people that are in there are Black and Brown people. Racism and casteism has a cost, and it's coming after our elders, and it's coming for us. So I think that one way that we have to think about healing is we have to center our bodies as part of this conversation. We can't just be intellectual revolutionaries. We actually have to be present with understanding what is happening to our bodies in the face of this violence. And that might mean building more mindfulness. It might mean, I'm not working 20-hour days. I'm going to try and work, 11 or 12-hour days, but make sure that I'm building in time for meditation. I'm building in some form of physical exercise. I'm being kind in terms of my mental health, and I'm getting mental health resources for what I need. I'm centering the whole of myself, not burning 90% of my body in order to fight for freedom, because there won't be any of you left on the other side of the movement. And that's a hard lesson to learn as an oppressed person, particularly because your nervous system might be wired to be continually in fight mode. But knowing, when you start with the body, you have to have a literacy of your survival mechanisms. Am I someone who's consistently in an agitated state? Am I fighting? Am I fleeing? Or am I freezing? Or do I know how to modulate my nervous system so I can have a neutral position? And I'm aware also where sometimes my nervous system might even go into dorsal or shut down place. A lot of times things are happening to you as an oppressed person that you don't have literacy for. And as a result, you're kind of letting the system of oppression carry you along, as opposed to you being the master of your own experience. So there's a great deal of learning and control that needs to come into play. And it's not just for the realm of the privilege, or it's not something that just bougie people do. There are ways that all working class people have found ways to nurture themselves in the face of violence. And so I think that there is a piece where individual healing actually opens up the pathway for systemic and interpersonal healing. And I think that what I've seen is that when caste oppressed people center ourselves, we actually force caste privileged people to then look at what's going on with their ish. And so we have a whole training that we do in the Unlearning Caste Supremacy workshop at Equality Labs that really kind of takes the lessons of the intellectual knowledge of what caste is, its history, and the movements to fight it, with training people into understanding their nervous systems. So that partnership then allows us to create very authentic movements that then work together to try to take down and build caste equity across the United States. Because you are basically constantly dealing with the nervous systems of the bigoted. So if you're not creating and knowing ways to create effective boundaries, to know how to care for yourself and love yourself while you're facing bigotry and gaslighting, you won't be an effective advocate and you're going to burn out, right? So there's a big part of us retraining how we do movement together, and also knowing that we're seeing a long view to our contribution to these movements. And so we're not responsible for the transformation of all of it. We're responsible for our part. But if we start to see ourselves as part of a collective, loving whole, we can see that feminist future that allows us, for all of us, to be free, and really unlearn the bad lessons we've learned from white supremacy and capitalism and Brahminism, And for folks that are hearing the term Brahminism for the first time, that's the animating ideology that started the caste system. So just like you wouldn't talk about anti-Blackness without talking about white supremacy, you don't talk about the caste violence and caste apartheid without talking about Brahminism. So it's an ideology that we need to get to know, because it's part of the oppression of hundreds of millions of people around the world.
Oh yeah. And with that, I kind of want us to I want you to talk to the audience right quick, kind of directly. What is one thing you want all of us to leave tonight, kind of to take action around caste abolition?
Well, I think one thing that is so important is that, particularly in the United States, racial violence and racial inequity is like the framework for how we understand injustice. But I just want to invite folks to open up their frame a little bit, that globally, the North American frame around race is not the only thing that dominates people around the world. And caste is a sister system of exclusion that we really need the globe to be active on. And it's here in the United States. We have people that are being exploited here. The state of California sued the Cisco Corporation for creating a casteist hostile workplace. And there was the BAPS Temple networks that actually trafficked Dalit workers for $1 an hour, called those workers worms, and they did it in 5 temple sites around the country. So it is an issue that is severe, and we've got to address it. And so I would just ask everyone here, like, if you want to do a couple of things to fight for caste abolition, buy this book, read it with your friends, buy it from, bookshop.org's, Busboys and Poets link, so that you support Busboys and Poets at the same time, and read it in community. Because I think when you read it in community, you have the ability to kind of wrestle with those questions together and really think about ways that you can make a collective impact. And small things, like if you work at an institution, ask them to add caste as a protected category to its list of to its non-discrimination policies. That is super easy, very cheap, and but it really shows that your workplace, is a safe place for Dalit people. And have events related to caste-oppressed people. So April is Dalit History Month, and that's an awesome time to do an event that celebrates Dalit thinking, Dalit leaders, Dalit books, Dalit life, and we always have a toolkit that we release out of Equality Labs that we'd love to share with you. And so make an effort to, be connected to caste-oppressed people by sharing our holidays and sharing our wisdom. And then finally, sign up for, Equality Labs' mailing list. Go to equalitylabs.org, sign up. You will get plugged into the movement. You'll find out where the action is. And we'd love to see you in our meetings and in the streets, because we are not stopping till we get caste equity around the world. And it starts here with each and every one of you all that came.
Thank you. And to kind of leave folks in a more hopeful and, in a state to want to fight for this new future, hopefully, what do you think the future could hold? What do you imagine out of it?
Well, I think that, the greatest threat to systems of violence are oppressed people with an imagination. And the imaginary is this really potent place where we can create the sandbox of the futures that we want to live in. So I think, Lori, this might be a really great place for me to read one of the last sections of the book, if you don't mind.
Please do. I will exit stage left.
Okay. So it's from the section that's called The Final Frontier, the Imaginary. Violence is meant to silence and damage the imaginary. Most people cannot begin to fight for freedom because they cannot even imagine themselves to be free. That is why socially engaged art is so crucial for this work. When our communities are facing the dire threats of climate change, state violence, white supremacy, Islamophobia, and caste apartheid, one of the primary battlegrounds is our imagination. The battle for our people is the battle for the imagination. And for me, the imaginary is a collective landscape. Imagination often feels too small compared to the imaginary, because the imaginary is a landscape of the symbolism of a society or the symbolism of a people. It's where all of us are putting our ideas and our hopes and our dreams. A collective imaginary could be a nightmare landscape, or it could be one filled with dreams and possibilities. As socially engaged artists, my work is about addressing the fact that in our communities, one of the first wounds we experience from systematic oppression happens in the imaginary. The psychological wounds of racism, classism, casteism start their work by telling our people that we are less than human, that our possibilities are limited, and that our strategies can only go so far. That is akin to being a bird that learns of its wings in a cage. But socially engaged art is a reminder that our wings were meant for the sky, and that we are unlimited in our potential for change, and the power to be fully determined in our communities is our own. That is why a core question I have in my artistic practice is, can we dream beyond our oppression? How do we dream of interdependence? We are imagining now for our very lives. We are imagining back from the greatest crisis of white supremacy and Brahminism that they believe that the rest of the world, that not even the world itself matters. That is why this is a call for freedom in a moment of pain. It is a radical dreaming. There is a future that can hold many futures, where we survive and even thrive. Can we find her through collective imagining? She reaches backward and forward to us. She whispers in our dreams, "Find me, and I will find you." She calls through questions into this moment. Are we brave enough to keep dreaming? Are we fierce enough to hold the door open as despair, anger, and greed want to close it? Can we love ourselves enough not to do the oppressor's work for them? To stop our loved ones from self-erasure? What are we willing to do for that possibility? This is why our imagination is our greatest weapon. We must imagine ourselves and beyond our socialization. Now more than ever, we need art that can be our heartbeat, a North Star, a map to a way out of this mess. For me, this is a Dalit feminist metaverse, where Dalit feminist futures span out glorious timelines of consent, possibility, wonder, and life. And I know sometimes with the burdens of the present, it can feel like we are now just digging up the bones of all the dead that we have lost to these vicious systems, while our oppressors are unfurling their schemes to steal the stars. But I trust my heart when I say our futures point to other timelines, beyond domination, of healing multiverses where we might thrive and dream of collective joy and infinite opportunity. We must surrender to the call of this historical moment. We will not retreat. We will not go back. We will create, dream, and imagine freedom for all of us.
Thank you for sharing. Crystal Wycliffe just put up the like little like hands up in prayer, like the little like yes praise emojis, and that's just how I felt the entire time you were talking. That was really beautiful. Thank you. And with that, we're going to go through some questions that folks have. So Chantel A. McCoy asked, at some point, I wonder if you're familiar with Isabel Wilkerson's book, Caste, The Origins of Our Discontent, where she compares India's caste system to what goes on here in the U.S. with African Americans and or people of color.
Sure. Thank you, Chantel, for that question. And so, I think with Isabel Wilkerson's book, one thing that she's really pointing to is that there is a historical reality that was very unique to the United States. And that is that in the face of Jim Crow, many Black abolitionists were looking for legal language to understand how to build a body of racial civil rights, because American legal theory to that point was based on segregation and dehumanization. So the legal codes and statutes that were really helpful for those legal pioneers were essentially they were using language that came from caste. So that's why in the United States you have many those early legal battles use the term caste and racial caste in a lot of the writings in order to be able to do that. So I really appreciate Isabel Wilkerson's approach in kind of seeing many different caste systems, because I think that makes sense in that context. And, I know that there's people, both who are Black and who are Dalit who weren't necessarily happy with that comparison. But I actually think that it's important for us to allow for oppressed people to theorize with each other, around each other, without the white gaze. And I would say that Isabel Wilkerson has earned more than enough the stage to be able to say the things that she wants, to pull the theories and comparisons that you want, and we can listen, you can disagree. But I also think that, it comes from a historical reality, which is very specific to the United States. And it's one of the reasons why I think that there's been so many relationships between Black and Dalit people and movements over the years. That internationalism has a root in our shared experiences of dehumanization and our shared battles for freedom. And currently in the United States, it's one of the reasons why caste-oppressed people are asking for caste to be added as a protected category is we know our history. We know that it's there. The government also agrees with us, which is why there's numerous, governmental bodies from the EEOC to the California Department of Fairness and Employment and Housing who are encouraging folks to add caste as a protected category because they see it protected under current categories because of this history. And now we as Dalit people are saying it's not enough. We're facing violence. We need the law to be implemented so that all workplaces can be safe. Stand with us and change your policies and make all workplaces welcome for all workers. So thank you for that question.
Yeah. And this question might have been made moot, but I'm going to ask it anyways. The way caste is reproduced here in the U.S., like we see it manifesting in the United States. As you mentioned, the Brahmin group, they're not necessarily in power here in the U.S. Is this reproduction caste, colorism, racism, all three?
It really depends on the context. I don't want to paint anything with like a broad cloth, but what we're seeing is that in American institutions, whether it's schools or corporate workplaces or small businesses, if it's a sector where there is a large amount of South Asians who are employed, you will start to see caste recreated within those environments. And this is why there's been so much discussion about caste in tech, because it's a sector where there's a ton of South Asians that are employed. And in fact, many who are on H-1B visas. And you see a lot of caste dynamics inside tech companies. So whether it's Google or Amazon or Facebook or Apple, we've had workers complain of, open slurs, inside the workplace, bullying and harassment, sexual harassment, and people being demoted and even fired on the basis of caste. And many HR departments didn't know what was going on because they were not caste literate to what was happening. And many caste oppressed people, I remember this one caste oppressed worker said, well, why would I even report it to HR? They probably don't even know where India is on the map, let alone are they going to understand what's happening to me, And that's not the way, civil rights and worker, labor laws, demand compliance in terms of creating safe workplaces. Like, it's not, the burden is not on the worker, it's on the institution to make sure that level of bigotry and harassment isn't happening. So, that's a big part of, why, we've spent such a large amount of time explaining what caste is, and also sectors where there are high amounts of South Asians, just making sure that, places are really working on building their caste equity competency by adding caste as a protected category, conducting trainings, bringing in Dalit speakers, and really doing everything that's possible to prevent this level of bigotry.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Because, you're entirely right. To call it one thing or making everything like related to either one of what I said is just, there's so much intricacy behind it and so much, sorry, I'm like really stuck on the HR department, not even understanding what caste is, and then having to look at a workplace and say, oh gosh, like there's something going on here that we're not quite sure. We're not really aware of the social cues, the just awareness that some folks have around it that others don't.
Well, and the thing is that the great experience I've had has been that a lot of HR folks are always, I think a lot of people go into HR and go into diversity and equity work because they are people of color and they want to make workplaces that are safer. So even though, I think we opened with this really kind of intense case that's happening at Cisco, in the wake of that Cisco case, we've seen thousands of workers come out and ask for safety in their workplaces. And we've seen many multinational corporations add caste as a protected category and really begin this conversation. So I think that we are seeing a sea change of what's possible. And are there bigots and detractors? Absolutely. Look at after Brown versus education, we still have places like Florida that are trying to ban critical race theory. The circle of the way that bigotry kind of comes back again, that I think is really what happens when nervous systems aren't retrained to really accept equity. You could change the law, but if you haven't changed the hearts and minds and the psyches of the privileged, they just kind of bide their time until they get power again and then come back to take back our rights, So that's why I think this lens of trauma, which I think, again, I really am so indebted to the work of people like Resma Menachem and Eduardo Duran and, Maria Leinhorst Braveheart, who really have championed this work in the context of settler colonialism and racism. I think there is such deep, deep learning for us in the concept of caste. And I hope that this is a book that launches even more conversations around this and really leads to people transforming their nervous systems and their communities.
Thank you so much for joining us, Thenmozhi. I am going to be walking around the world feeling a little bit better about the state of the world, knowing that someone like you is a part of an organization like Equality Labs that is doing the really great and important work in so many different sectors. Because we've talked about civil rights, we've talked about labor rights, we've talked about, housing and all of that. It's also interwoven into the very basis of what life is and can be. And yeah, I just want to thank you on behalf of the audience members. Joel Young says, I just purchased this on Audible. Can't wait to listen.
Oh, thank you.
And Crystal Wycliffe says, amazing. Thank you so much. Can't wait to purchase the book. And with that, folks, you can purchase a copy tonight on Eventbrite until 10 p.m. at the same place where you RSVP'd. We will have signed copies available at our 14th and V location, our flagship in Washington, D.C. If you're far far from home for us here in the DMV and not near a Busboys, you can go ahead and log on to bookshop.org and just look it up in the search bar, The Trauma of Caste, and you'll be able to find your copy and support your local independent bookstore, whether that's us here at Busboys or some of the amazing other stores and colleagues we have across the country.
Well, and if I could say something, Lori, I just can't emphasize enough to the audience how important it is to support bookstores like Busboys and Poets, because, you know, it was really Busboys and Poets and independent bookstores that supported women of color feminist writing for many years. Like now it might feel a little bit more accessible to get it, but it really wasn't. And I think that it's so important that we honor our roots and we honor the really profound ways that community and beloved community is held by institutions like Busboys and Poets. So please, if you can, don't buy your book from the Big A, buy it from Busboys and Poets, please. And actually you can only get the signed copy through Busboys and Poets. So you have to do it, you know. So please, you know, thank you so much for hosting us, Lori. It was really amazing and a dream come true, because again, I feel like I grew up as a reader, you know, coming into your stores and eating the tastiest food. And now to be here, it's just, my heart feels really full. So thank you so much for creating a space for this powerful conversation around caste abolition and freedom and healing.
Of course. I mean, thank you for creating the space to even have that conversation. And because your book, I mean, we're seeing more and more books coming out about trauma and about these systems of oppression that aren't necessarily like very like in front of us here in the United States and very obvious. But like you said, that accessibility hasn't always been there. And we're still seeing like some like pushbacks in publishing with regards to like print runs and other things. So thank you. And hold up that gorgeous book one more time.
Here it is. And, you know, to that end, I couldn't be here without North Atlantic Books. They really loved this book with me into life. And, you know, support your independent publishers and your independent bookstores and pick up this book and read it in community. And find me on socials. I'm there on Twitter and on Instagram at Dalit Diva. And I always answer my readers' questions, because there's a lot of opening, I think, that happens with this book. And so I've been really deeply moved by people's healing and the openings that have occurred. So reach out to me after you've read it. I'd love to hear from you.
And with that, folks, you know where to find her, and you know where to find us on our Facebook and YouTube page in the future for your wonderful book needs. Thank you all so much for joining us. Peace and love, and we hope you're having a happy start to the new year.
Bye, J. Beam and J. Salva.